Hi, I'm Alex Bourbon, and in this video we're looking at how we can deliver more personalised feedback using rubrics and self-evaluation from students together. So jumping in to have a look at what we actually did. The first thing we had to work out was how we might collect the students' self-evaluation. So to do that we used a Microsoft form, fairly straightforward, name ID, and then the rubric that they'd already been presented with, but rather than descriptors for each section, which they would have had in the original briefing document, there's a tick box and they identify where they think they sit on the scale. So students could respond to that. Based on what they responded, we can output that from MS Forms as a spreadsheet. So the spreadsheet that comes out, the first sections of that spreadsheet will look very much like this. So I've anonymised these rows, but there would be some names, some student numbers, again some anonymised numbers, and then there'd be, for the different marking points, I've got 12 marking points, there'd be the categories that they rated themselves, and I've just left the first 4 students to respond in. It's not alphabetical or anything, but you've got a good cross section of how they thought they did there. So that's the first bit where we've just copied and pasted that information, their feedback on themselves, their self-reflections, into this spreadsheet. And I'm going to make this marking spreadsheet available alongside the video on my website, and linked to in the comments for this video as well, so you've got access to it. So I've got my overall summary sheet there. The other thing I've got before I start to do anything is I've got a blank marking grid, and in my blank marking grid I'm going to zoom out a little bit. So in these sections, for your assessments, for my assessment when I set it, there was some specific criteria. I've changed the numbers slightly, but there was some specific criteria. What did fair look like? What did good look like? What was the difference between very good and excellent? So it was a bit more detailed, depending on what the marking point was. And some of these I've got associated out of 0 to 5, and some are marked 0 to 10. Again, depending on the complexity of the point. At the bottom, I've got some blank areas where I can put the student's name, surname, and ID. And what we're going to do is we're going to plot the students' perceptions of how they did onto this grid, and then we're going to allocate a mark for each section, and we'll be able to visually see how we compare to the students' perception of how they did. In order to be able to do that, before we can even start to do it for all our students, we have to make sure that Excel knows what the different grade boundaries are. So my 5 categories, 6 categories, no 5 categories: poor, fair, good, very good, and excellent. If I scroll across, this bit would normally be hidden from students. I'd normally just make it white text. But I've got 2 columns for poor, 2 for fair, 2 for every category. And in those columns, I'm identifying what's the lower boundary mark, what's the upper boundary mark. So a poor would be 0 marks. Fair would be 1 mark. A good, for this first marking point, would be between 2 and 3. If you go down a bit further to the 4th marking point, a fair is between 1 and 2. A good's 3 to 5. A very good's 6 to 8, and an excellent's 9 to 10. So whatever I've written in the grid, I've broken down by the upper and lower bounds in this bit off to the right. Students never need to see that once that's set up. So before I do anything else, I'm going to make that white text and remove all my borders. It's still there, it's just students can't see it. So students will mainly be looking on this left-hand portion of the sheet. So my marking grid is just about set up. I've also got, I've got spaces for me to allocate a mark. I've got space to add some personalised comments, and then there's a formula that appears to be saying not applicable at the moment. But in a few moments, that's going to read in what category, what rating the students gave for their individual marking criteria. So now I've got my summary sheet just about how I want it to look. I've also got a key there, and I'll explain that in a moment. I'm going to go back to the summary page, and on the summary page I've left a button with a macro attached. So this is an XLSM, a macro-enabled workbook. If you've opened my copy that I've left available for download, you will have to enable macros in order to be able to use this function. But there's 2 macros built in that are really useful. So the first one, when I click the blue button, it's going to generate a separate sheet for every row in this spreadsheet that's populated, and it's going to do that by copying the blank mark sheet. So it's going to copy blank mark sheet, and you'll see what it does. So now I've got a sheet for every student. Last name, first name, that's just the column heading, so I can delete that one. And actually the very top one was blank, so I can delete the top row as well. So I've now got my first 4 students that match my summary. So you can see student 1 thought they were fair, good, good, fair. If I go to student 1, fair, good, good, fair. And it's plotted in grey the student's perception of themselves onto that grid. What I can now do, it's also pulled through their name, their ID, and it's pulled through some of their details down there as well as to how they thought they did. What I can do now is I can allocate marks to the student. So I can say, okay, I think they actually did better than they thought. So let's give them, let's say they were very good across the board. Let's say they were excellent in that one, and that one, and this one. Oops. So here you can see quite visually where the yellow is further along. The yellow marks what I thought they did, how I thought they behaved. So the yellow is higher up, so I can put in this additional comments. You performed better than you thought here because... and I can explain why they actually were actually in the very good section rather than just down here at fair. Further down, we didn't actually have them do worse than they thought, did we? Let's change that. So where the yellow is further to the left, my perception, I believe, based on marking it, that they're worse than they thought they were. We can add comment in here. Weren't quite as good as you thought here. Can't spell here. As you thought. Because you missed. And then whatever they missed, for instance. And then where there's no grey box showing, that's because the yellow, my marking, sits on top of the grey cell. So I've agreed with the student, for instance, on point 10. So I can put I agree with you here to improve further. You could. So we're doing the same sort of marking, the same sort of feedback we already were doing. We're using the rubric, but we're able to personalise it to the students because we can compare. There's that extra little layer comparing what they thought they did to how we're perceiving they did. So that's how you can generate the sheet. And as I say, I'll make that template available for you. I'll delete my sheets that I've just made first. Once you've got that, you're going to probably want to put it back into your virtual learning environment or share it with students in some way. Now, the summary sheet will have the totals because it's adding up as we go along. So I've put some numbers in for the first student. They got 57. So you can read out and you can use VLOOKUPs and things to read into virtual learning environments if you want to do that. But more importantly, getting that feedback out is useful. So the second feature, which I could probably have put on a button as well, but let's go into Visual Basics on the Developer tab, open up Visual Basic. There's a second module in here called Split Workbook. Let's allocate that to a second shape. Make it easy. So I am still going to have to go into Visual Basic thinking about it, because in here there is a section. Maybe there isn't. So now we've got our second shape. I can go in here, I can click that orange button, and the orange button is going to take every single sheet in my workbook and save it as its own separate .xlsm file. Let's give that a go. You can see it's saved them to a local folder. Let's have a look at that and see what it looks like. So here you can see I've opened up the folder it's told me to from the desktop, and you can see I've got a separate worksheet for every single tab within Excel. So I can open up an individual students. This is the one we were working on. It's just loading now. There we go. And it's loaded just their feedback. So that will be saved with their surname and first name as their feedback. So you could then upload that into your VLE or share it with your student. A couple of tips: if you're using a VLE where you can bulk upload your files, you may want to consider the file naming convention. So check how you would bulk upload the files first. The VLE I was working with and our institution, we don't bulk upload files at the moment, so I didn't have that problem. But you might want to just check how you name the files, and you might have to edit your Visual Basic code, so you might just have to look at the naming in the code as to how that's structured. The other thing that you might want to think about is if you're looking to email these to students, you're not going to be able to email them as XLSM files. Most email servers have got security features that stop macro-enabled workbooks being emailed. You don't need it to be macro-enabled now that you've got each student as their own individual copy. So each individual file you could resave as an Excel file if you had to email it, but they should all upload into a VLE absolutely fine. So there we've got an example of how to take self-evaluation, self-reflection from a Microsoft form from every student, put it into a workbook in Excel. I'll make that template available. Share that across in individual tabs in Excel, so you can mark each student individually using a rubric, and then export it back out of Excel into individual files that are useful to be used for students and for their individual and personalised feedback, because you're able to really speak to not just how they performed, but how they performed with reference to how they think they performed, which is an extra layer and extra depth to the feedback and the quality of the feedback. And if you do use these tools and resources and you find them helpful, please do drop a comment in the chat to say how you used them, where you're from, the sort of feedback your students gave. It's always good to hear what other colleagues and other students are thinking. Thank you. I hope you found that useful. If you're interested in other things that I'm putting together, please do subscribe to the channel. Please do check back on the website as to other things as they go online. Thank you very much.